eu volto a pedir desculpa por este atraso, que não é da responsabilidade do nosso autor, claro.
Em português dizem que a culpa morreu solteira.
Exato. Hoje temos a honra de ter cá a Maaza Mengiste, que é uma das autoras contemporâneas mais importantes. Este livro, o Rei-Sombra, foi o primeiro livro da coleção VIDA PRIVADA DOS LIVROS, dirigida pelo Alberto Manguel, nosso autor. Este foi o primeiro, abrimos muito bem. O último é do Amos de Bola, que acabou de sair. Temos também o Patrick de Ville, Francisco Delicado, a Susan Swan e o Black No More, do Schuyler. É uma coleção que nós gostamos muito porque de facto são livros que foram muito importantes e que são ainda importantes e que nunca estiveram publicados.
Falta a Santa Rita ali.
Onde é que estão? Não me deram. Depois falta, tens razão, falta a Santa Rita. Eu pedi, pedi todos. Exato, falta a Santa Rita. Todos eles têm prefácios de escritores muito renomados, desde o Coetzee ao Gabriel,
Juan Gabriel Vázquez, Olga do Charco,
o Miyakoto, Coetzee, exato. Portanto, é uma coleção que de facto é daquelas que vai ficar, parece-me. Hoje temos o prazer de ter aqui a Maaza. O Alberto vai conversar com a Maaza acerca do nosso Rei-Sombra. Eu espero que gostem da sessão. Eu estou ansiosa por ouvir.
Falamos em inglês, tá?
Sim. A sessão vai ser em inglês, sim. Welcome, Maaza.
Obrigada.
Bem, ante tudo, desculpa, porque eu problemas de organização do carro, enfim, a culpa não é minha. Mas it's so good to see you. So, you have published this book, which is in fact your second novel. So let's start with the future. When's the next novel coming out?
Well, Alberto knows very well that this book took me 10 years. So it really is book 2 and 3. And I'm working on the next one, hopefully a little faster than this one.
Yes, I hope to see it before my email. Maaza, a very important subject in your work is a subject that's essential today. We are in the midst of several world wars, a lack of dialogue, and a misunderstanding of the other's identity. The question of identity is at the core of your work. Can you talk a little about the question of identity in this particular book, O Rei-Sombra?
Well, I mean, at the very basic level, the book is set during Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia in 1935 in an attempt to colonize it. And the way that Mussolini was able to prepare for the invasion, prepare for the war, was to craft a narrative about the identity of Ethiopians as uncivilized, savage, primitive. They needed the benevolent helping hand of Italy. But in order to craft what an African, what an Ethiopian was, in order to craft that identity, you also have to craft an Italian identity. So the Italians were making themselves in relation to how they saw Africans, Ethiopians, Eritreans, Somali, but also before that, Libyans. And so there was a narrative being crafted of what an Italian was, what an Italian man was, what a fascist man was. And if those things remained rigid, then the war could proceed as planned.
As
and the world
today,
would be
I
okay.
just interrupt to say that what you are describing is exactly what is happening between Israel and Palestine, between Russia and the Ukraine. It's the construction of the other as uncivilized, and we who are civilized will come and help these poor people.
Yeah, I mean, these narratives are so rigid right now. They have been set in stone, and I think that I have more faith in the common people than I do in politicians. And I have much more faith in the younger generation that is refusing to let everything happen in silence. I think that what has unfolded, if I can speak of what's happening right now in Gaza, I think that what has happened in Gaza, not only is it a catastrophe of inhuman proportions that I think is beyond even a way that I can describe it, but what has happened there has also not allowed Israelis to grieve and mourn the way that they should for people that have died. We are watching, as we should, what's happening in Gaza and saying we need to stop this. But it's also, there's no room for Israeli grief and mourning because that space has been taken over by violence and vengeance. And I think that I think the middle ground for this is coming from Jewish allies across the world who are saying, yes, we are grieving, as we should, but we're also insisting that this has to stop.
And this is the ancient model of the Greek. The Greek tragedians who were able to speak about themselves as conquerors, but the Persians, for instance, as victims, and give the victim a central role. That disappears with Rome and Carthage, which we are repeating now. But going back to what you were saying about the younger generation and also the Israelis that are, well, Amos Oz spoke about compromise, that it's not an ugly word, we should use it, and he was battered because of that. But do you think that in this eternal war that seems not to have an issue in spite of those voices you described, does literature have any role?
I have been talking about this with friends of mine. Many of us in this past year have been asking the question of what is the role of the writer in this? What is the role of words? What do we say in the face of things that feel unspeakable? We should not even be witnessing what we're witnessing, and yet we're seeing things it's being broadcast live. But you know, Alberto, when we were together in Portugal, in Lisbon, maybe 2 years ago, and we were having the same conversation about Ukraine and Russia, not understanding that the world was about to erupt again. And I can imagine having this same conversation in the midst of the Rwandan genocide or what was happening in Bosnia and in that. Like
Or during the war in Ethiopia.
We've been having these kinds of conversations about what is the possibility of language and words. And this genocide that's happening in Gaza, the intense grief and suffering that's happening across across Palestine, across the world, in Israel, people's deep fear, I think makes me realize that our writing is necessary. We need to record what's happening. We can't let history pretend that this did not happen, you know, when we look back on this. But at the same time, and here's a question that I've been speaking to Palestinian friends about, writers, that in what way can our words have a material effect to stop this catastrophe? In what way can we move from writing words on a page to be read for a future generation to doing something that will stop this now? And I think, I don't know the answer to that, unfortunately, but that's where I am.
But you will continue to write. You don't believe with Auden that poetry makes nothing happen.
Absolutely.
With Adorno that you can't write after Auschwitz. You don't believe that.
I don't believe it.
Why?
But I believe because I'm a writer and I have to believe in the sacredness of words.
So it's a question of faith? Poetic faith?
Well, it's also this belief that as human beings, we are all of us inclined towards community. And I think we lean towards telling each other stories. We
And
lean
killing each
towards
other at the same
expressing.
time.
Well, we craft the stories to allow the killing, right? But the job of writers and other people is to push against that. We have our own narratives. So, yes, if I did not believe that this, let's just say, if I did not believe that the books that I have assigned my students to read over the years did not make a change, so that they are on the streets, you know, marching to stop this conflict, you know, then I would wonder about the point of words. But I do believe that what they have been taught over the years has made a difference. What they have read has made a difference. And we see it now with the climate activists, with those people that are, you know, of course there's Gaza, but there's also Sudan, there's also Tigray, there's also Ethiopia, there are all these regions, there's also Sudan and Congo, and we already know there's more coming. We can feel it. So,
do you think that as human beings, you are speaking about the, I suppose, the survival impulse through the words, but at the same time, we have a suicidal impulse. Does it also go through words?
you know what I'm thinking of, Alberto, right now that you said that? I'm thinking of these ancient cave drawings. And I think those drawings that we're all familiar with of the horse and the man and the cow and this, it's a visual language for I am here. That's not a suicidal impulse. That is a recognition of existence and life and a message to the future. I am here now. And I think that's what writing, we're continuing that tradition.
In 100 Years of Solitude, you have a scene that encapsulates exactly that, because the village of Macondo is struck by amnesia, and so people very quickly want to put on objects what they are so they don't forget. This is a cow, it gives milk, it mix it with coffee, it could have coffee with milk, and so on. And perhaps the writer is doing that, affixing labels to things so that we don't forget.
Yeah, and this reminds me of a book by someone you know, I think, well, David Reif, in Praise of Forgetting.
Yes.
And
Susan Sontag's son.
Yes,
Yes.
And I was just reading a book by Lewis Hyde, a primer for forgetting. And Lewis Hyde's idea in this book is maybe we say never forget. We speak about holding on to our history, but maybe there are times when we need to let go of certain things in order to move forward as a collective. And I think that there is, thinking of these cave drawings again, those cave drawings had spaces in between, that not everything was documented, that there were things to be remembered and there were things that did not have to be remembered in that.
The founder of the Holocaust Museum in London said, "I will forget when others remember."
Wow.
And maybe what you're doing is asking us to remember so that you can forget and write about other things. Because in your books, and let's talk particularly about Rei-Sombra, the idea that the identity that politics forges for us can be a false identity, but even that false identity is not that easy. That man who carries a name like Ulysses Nobody, Minim, how do you pronounce it?
Minim.
Has an identity that's false. He's not the king, but nevertheless he represents in the world some kind of action, some kind of position taking that you show how it evolves in him and transforms for him and for the others.
Yeah.
Maybe you can tell a little bit about the story for those who haven't read it.
Sure. In the novel, there is a character, in the novel, but actually also in historical fact, Haile Selassie left Ethiopia in the middle of the war and went to the UK to continue to try to make some diplomatic end for the war. That was the first time that an Ethiopian emperor has ever left his people in a war. An Ethiopian fighting style of warfare at that time, the old traditional style, was that during combat, the way that a lot of in Western military, the commanders, the top people are often away from the battle and they are instructing the soldiers and so on what to do. But in Ethiopian warfare, traditional style, the emperor and all of those leaders in the military are in the front rows. And they lead. They're the first to die. That's part of what leadership means. So when he left, it shattered the morale of Ethiopian fighters. Okay, now comes the novel part. The novel, in my book, I have a peasant whose name is Minim, which means nothing. And
like Ulysses, nobody. Yeah.
And he happens to look strikingly like Haile Selassie. So one of the armies says, "We're going to dress you up as the emperor, and you will parade in front of these armies and inspire them to fight. We will tell them that what the Italians are saying, the Italians are celebrating, it's not true. The emperor did not leave. Here you are." And this is a man, Minim is a man that is a musician. He's poor, grew up, he's a farmer, has no desire to dress up in these clothes and start behaving like the emperor, and also be targeted by Italians. But in the course of the novel, he begins to think of himself in a different way because everyone else thinks of him as the emperor. And so I think these narratives can shift. I mean, they can shift the person, a little bit.
For you, they shifted as well when you discovered something about your grandmother.
Oh, yeah. The book took me 10 years because I was really looking for information about women that were fighting in the war. I knew that they were there. I had heard little stories from people, and I discovered then a few photographs in Italian archives, and I decided, oh, this is really something. I need to look at this, and it changed my whole book. And so I was doing extensive research in Rome, in archives, and so on. And then when the book was almost done, I was speaking to my mother about these women, and she said, what about your great-grandmother? You know, she enlisted in the war. And I had no idea that this was in my own family. And I was so shocked that I said, what did you say? She said, your great-grandmother, she enlisted. And I was really, I couldn't believe it. And I said, you know, I've been researching this for 10 years, trying to find this. Why didn't you tell me? And she
Because
said,
you never asked.
You never asked. So, which means all of you should go ask your families, what is it that you haven't told me? But I did not think to ask. I did not think that in my family was something called history. Because women speak stories to women and girls in the places where women gather, in the kitchen, in the bedrooms, in the place where men are on this side, women are on this side, and they're speaking. We don't imagine that what women are speaking is history, as important as what's in textbooks or what men speak in political circles. And so I realized these kitchen stories, which are my mother knew because her sisters told her. Her sisters knew because their mother told them. You know, then their grandmother knew because, you know, it was passed down through women, not men. And I now think about these kitchen stories as significant and as important as what we get in textbooks.
Just as a detail, you know, I arrived in Portugal barely 4 years ago, so I was trying to find out personal stories.
Yeah.
And my men friends gave me a story about the dictatorship of Salazar, but it was a kind of official story. And it was only when I started speaking to my women friends that their mothers and grandmothers had a very, very different experience of the dictatorship, and a very active one. I discovered, for instance, there was a whole group of women who, to make some money, were writing cheap detective novels, but in those detective novels, under male pseudonyms, of course, there was criticism of the dictatorship, which the censor didn't look at because it was a detective novel. So you're absolutely right that we have to find history not in the conventional places, because we get conventional history in those places, but in the other places. But your fiction is autobiographical only in that sense, that it's the experience that you found. But do you see your stories as reflection of larger stories, archetypal stories?
Yes. You know, I was writing Rei-Sombra.
Yes.
Okay. I was writing the book really thinking of and under the influence of two books. One is Homer's Iliad, which is one of my favorite texts. And the other book is an Italian book by Ennio Flaiano, Il Tempo di Uccidere, Time to Kill.
He's one of the great Italian novelists that nobody reads today, so we will do it in VIDA PRIVADA DOS LIVROS. Yes, with
good.
your introduction.
Oh, good. I think I already agreed to this.
Well, you have a public witness your work.
And Flaiano is also the writer of La Dolce Vita and some of Fellini's films, right?
The script writer for Fellini.
Yeah. And so, but in that book, A Time to Kill, there is an Italian soldier that rapes this Ethiopian girl, and she is silent throughout the whole thing. And the book is really about the guilt of this Italian and how he keeps. Can I tell the
Of
story?
course, yes. And it hasn't been translated yet, so they will forget by the time they read the book.
It should be read. It should be read. But he tries to turn himself in, and the Italian administrator said this is not a big deal, because by accident he kills her. And he tries, but nobody will take this guilt seriously, and it's her father that comes in complete anguish, which makes for some really powerful scenes in that book. But I was thinking about that book also, and the complete silence of this Ethiopian character in Flaiano's book, and how the book is about Italian guilt, but doesn't give this woman the opportunity to fight against her aggressor. And so I thought, my Hirut in this book, who is assaulted by an Ethiopian in the military, she's a soldier, but he is a commander, and he says, well, you can be a soldier on the battlefield, but when you come back to the camp, you are still a woman, and I am still over you. And so he assaults her, and she fights. And that is, in a sense, a response to Flaiano's book, and giving this Ethiopian character this chance. But the structure of the book was deeply indebted to the Greek tragedies, which I really love. The presence of the chorus, the way that the chorus becomes its own personality in the novel, or in the Greek tragedies, but especially
and in your novel.
And in the novel. But it's also in Ethiopia we have, I'm sure it's here too, I'm positive it's here, we still have what we call the Asmari, and the Asmari are musicians that are in villages but also in cities, and they play in these small bars, and they tell about the life of the village and who was a great hero in this part and who did this. They're speaking stories of that area in song, and they're also entertaining because they reveal who's having an affair with who and whose baby this is, and so they are the griots. So
in Portugal, maybe Barbara can give us the details. The revolution started with a song about a village. Which was that?
Grândola.
So that's telling the story of the village, and that triggered.
Yes, and so and Homer, and Homer had the chorus in this book, and the Greeks have used it, but it did not begin with the Greeks. They didn't invent it. This was a culture that was part of the world, part of communities, that we have learned about each other and ourselves through song, through these griots, through the Asmari, through the chorus, whatever they were called in these different communities. So I wanted to reflect that as well.
You mentioned the Iliad, you mentioned Flaiano. Flaiano is based on the Iliad because, of course, both the rape of the woman in Flaiano reflects the rape of the women in the Iliad, and also the meeting when the father appears. It's the most moving scene in the Iliad, where Achilles receives Priam, and Priam is coming to beg for the body of his son that Achilles killed, and Achilles is seeing the father of the man who killed his lover, and suddenly there's a change. the old man doesn't see the killer of his son, but sees the young man that his son was. And Achilles doesn't see the father of the killer of his lover, but sees his father that he will not see again. And the two men embrace and weep.
Yeah.
That's what should happen now in these wars that we're witnessing.
If only.
But you give, as you say, that those silent women, their voice. At the end of the Trojans, it's the grandmother, Hecuba, who is confronted with the dead body of her grandson, asks his blood to speak to us. And you have inherited that voice. But yes, it's you're right to mention the Iliad, you're right to mention Flaiano, because as you know, literature is a game of tag. And you are tagged by older hands.
So interesting. I did not know that Flaiano was really basing this on the Iliad. This is what I love talking to Alberto, because I learn something new all the time. But it makes sense, especially that scene in that book is one of the most powerful, but it's also one of the most powerful in the Iliad. And I thought about that. I've thought about that scene a lot. Because what had to happen in order for Priam to embrace Achilles is a level of forgetfulness.
Absolutely.
That,
and remembrance at the same time.
Exactly.
You forget the horror, but you rescue something positive.
Yes, and there is a kind of, thinking about even a legal amnesia that we call amnesty. Yeah. It's needed. Yeah. And unfortunately, the world is being propelled by other interests besides human life.
Absolutely. And the arms industry amongst them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, this is one of the tasks of writing, maybe, is to continue to reveal those things, that what's unfolding now is not it's happening because of people who care less about human beings than they do about money.
Your writing, important writing, exchanges the memory of revenge for the memory of what we have in common.
Yeah, and it's much easier to do that in literature, I think. But literature needs to offer us that kind of guidance.
Let's talk for a moment about your first novel.
Yeah.
Probably Barbara will publish it next. But
Did you know that?
It's a different take on the same subject of the Ethiopian War. But here, you, in this first novel, tell us a little bit about it, and tell us about that extraordinary character who is forced into the paradox of his profession to save lives in order for the lives to be extinguished.
Yeah. My first novel is called Beneath the Lion's Gaze, in Italian Lo Sguardo del Leone. I'm sure Portuguese might be close to that. But it's set during the Ethiopian Revolution that began in 1974. And I'm looking at one family, and the patriarch of that family is a doctor named Hailu. He's trying to do his best to keep his sons out of this revolutionary fervor. Students and professors and young people are marching against the emperor. When the emperor falls, a dictatorship comes in. The students continue to march, but they are now being killed and disappeared. And Hailu is trying to keep his son Dawit out of this. He's, as a doctor, works in the largest hospital in Addis Ababa. And one day, there is a young student, a girl that is brought in for him to take care of. She has been taken out of prison, where she has been severely tortured and raped. And his task is to keep her alive. So
that she can be
so the
tortured
soldiers
again.
can take her back. And that for him begins a dilemma of what is my role as a doctor or as a father or as a man to this girl who is unconscious. I don't want to give... Well, the book is not even published yet. So.
It will be. But the huge question is a question that I think is essential to the human condition. No act we perform is one-sided. No act is perfectly good or perfectly bad. So how do we choose? How do we choose whether to go into the war to fight against injustice or preserve peace by not fighting but then allowing for further injustice?
I don't know that. I mean, I don't know that question.
No, that's why you wrote the book.
I mean, this is why I wrote the book. But I think I wrote it though. I wrote that book during the American wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And I wrote specifically that character of Hailu after those photographs of Abu Ghraib were released.
Yeah.
And after there were all of these reports of torture in not Abu Ghraib, but in Bagram, I believe in Afghanistan. And I started to realize as stories of Guantanamo were coming out that there was no way that these men could survive what was being done to them if there were not doctors in that room.
And the same thing you can talk about any dictatorship in Argentina. The military dictatorship had doctors helping them.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so the question for me, that middle ground, that conflicted, complicated, is it complicated, but that conflicted position, complex position is one that we have to look at. Because I think that the world is not so kind, and we're going to be confronted with these again, and we are now, again and again. But if as individuals we can begin to understand maybe what our line is, we can, within the communities that we have, speak of that.
And speak of the complexity, because politics and commerce have taught us that what counts is a sort of catechism with answers yes or no.
Yeah.
Well, no serious question can bear an answer yes or no. It's much more complicated than anything that we can sound. This is the problem, going back to literature, that confronts Don Quixote. Don Quixote sees an act that's unjust, and he knows, according to the laws of chivalry, that he has to act. But many times, his action against injustice produces a greater injustice. But what do? Do you not act when he sees the little boy being beaten by his master? Doesn't he intervene, in spite of when he leaves, the master beats the boy even worse? And then when the boy meets Don Quixote much later, he says, "Do me a favor, next time you see me in trouble, please don't help," because it gets worse.
Yeah.
But how can you not help? What do you do?
Yeah, I'm thinking of two things right now that you're saying that. I was in conversation a few months ago with the Palestinian writer Adania Shibli, who's written a beautiful book called Minor Detail. I believe she'll be in Portugal in March.
Really?
Yes.
Everyone should please go hear that. But we were talking about and a story that broke out and then there was a photograph of, there was a young boy who might have been about 9 9 or 11, and he was carrying water to his family that had been displaced, and this was in Gaza, and he was shot by a sniper. And so another young man came, it ended up being his brother, to go collect the body. And he was shot also and killed. And we were talking about that impulse to help, to not leave a body in that undignified place. That there is, in all of these horrible videos and images that are coming out.
And in the Iliad.
There is this insistence to be human, you know, and it's almost without thinking, people are doing this. And I'm thinking right now too of these photographs and really horrible videos that have been released. They've been leaked out of Israeli prisons by Israeli soldiers who are saying, I'm terrified of revealing my name, but I cannot allow this to happen. And there is that insistence on a maintaining of maybe even an internal dignity, but also recognizing the dignity of other human beings that are being degraded. And I think that act
of putting out the information.
It's that complicated position that insists still on its own dignity, but also the dignity of the other human beings.
There is, I'm sorry to mention all that, but my references are classic simply because I find in those texts everything you're talking about. In Sophocles' play Ajax, the goddess Athena comes to Ulysses, her protege, and says, your enemy Ajax is smitten by disgrace and all horrible wounds, and he's suffering, and rejoice. And Ulysses says, I can't, because when I think of him suffering, I don't think of him as my enemy, but as a human being. And I think that we are all fleeting shadows and human. And in the play, Ulysses Odysseus teaches the goddess empathy, because he was probably a reader, and literature teaches empathy.
Well, it's also that scene in the Iliad where Achilles is dragging Hector's body around and around, and is it Athena? Who, I can't remember which goddess came down and said, we will preserve the body.
It's...
I can't remember.
I'm sorry,
But there is this scene where there is...
Yes, but in that scene, Homer interrupts and says, he dragged, and this is horrible scene, drags the body, and they passed the washing basins where the women in time of peace wash their linen. It's 2 lines, but to say, this is happening, but there is this also.
And well, I mean, this is Simone Weil, right? Like this Iliad happens so far from that place of comfort, but we're reminded that place once existed.
Absolutely. That's the brilliance of this of literature. When it works for us, it doesn't show us just one side. It's not this is horrible and this is beautiful. No, it's mixed, it's interwoven, and it's for us to do something with it.
Yeah, absolutely. And now you've brought me full circle. Now I'm talking about we should write. There is hope.
Good. But Kafka said, as you remember, he was talking with Max Brod, and Max Brod was driven crazy by his pessimism. And Kafka says something, and Max Brod says, but if you say that, there is no hope. And Kafka, with a big smile, says, no, there's hope, but not for us. But moving on to something more cheerful. You are very interested in photography.
Yeah.
So how does that start and how does that help you?
Photography has always helped me as a way to remove myself from words. When I'm writing, and then I can pick up a camera and walk, and I don't have to think about how does this sentence start, how does this end. But it's also, I realized over the years, it was a way for me to practice still how to frame a narrative, how within an image, how to still create a story without words. And it's pushed me, I believe, as a writer, to think more visually or more conceptually. I, in fact, just got my camera fixed.
Good.
It broke.
What camera is it?
It's a very, very old Leica, very old, with a very, very old lens, I think from the 30s that I've used. And I have a very special camera repair person, and she is the last living repair person that trained with Mr. Leica. So she's very old. And when I gave her my camera, she said, "Have you been on a plane with this?" And I travel a lot. I said, "Yeah." And so the camera's not with me this time.
Okay.
But it helps me. The photography it's another language. It's another.
Do you feel you're a photographer as well? Would you show your photographs?
For the very first time, I had a photo essay published in a magazine this past winter.
What magazine?
Epiphany magazine, and it was really interesting for me to have that experience, because I've normally said I'm not a photographer. I'm not really. I do it. I have such respect for people who do it. But it was the first time.
Do you feel that photography can approximate you to the truth better than words?
No, because I think a photograph can be as deceptive.
Mm-hmm. Do you know Tabucchi's Indian Nocturno Indian Nocturne?
No.
There's one scene where a woman photographer shows the narrative protagonist a photo and asks what he sees, and it's a photograph of a man just in ecstasy. And he says, well, it's somebody running happy. And she shows him the other part of the picture, it's somebody shooting him.
Oh, yeah.
So that's what photography can do.
That's it. That's it. Yeah. I'm thinking of, was it Robert Capa's photograph from the Spanish Civil Wars, where there was a man on it. It's a very famous photograph. But when you learn the history of that, it becomes a much more complicated image.
And less true?
Well, that's the question, right? Did it make us feel something about that war or that conflict? And if it were staged,
does it matter?
Does it matter? And that's
But you can ask the same thing of literature. If you say that you are Ethiopian, you have a documentary experience of the Ethiopian War, your family gave you stories, etc., and then we find out that in fact you are Finnish and never left Finland in your life.
I should tell you.
Well, we won't reveal that. You're obviously Finnish. But would that change the text for you?
That's interesting.
You gave me a story, and just maybe you can tell it, about a man who married a French woman, and she discovered that he was black. They all had black blood.
Oh yeah.
But tell the story.
There was, well, I think this was, okay, there's, this might be the one I was telling you about.
Feingold was, and then he went to Las Vegas and became a wood chopper.
Oh, I don't remember that story.
You wrote me that story. A man married a French woman, and then she found out that he had black blood, and he said, I didn't know, and she divorced him, and he was taken to court. And it was a court situation whether if you had black blood and didn't reveal it and got married, would it justify divorce?
Yes.
And you told me the story, and you told me that in the end, he left France, settled in Las Vegas, and became a woodcutter.
Yes, I remember that. I'm so sorry. Because there have been a few of these stories, but
Larson, the woman, the novelist, Nella Larson, wrote about something like that.
There was.
Well, tell them, because we're talking,
this
and
is
they
now,
have no idea what we're talking
well,
about.
I will say Nella Larson, who wrote this book, Passing, that was came out, I believe, in the 1930s during the Harlem Renaissance, was a story about two African American women, one of them who could pass for white, was so light-skinned, and her friend from high school who realizes suddenly, oh my gosh, she's passing for white, but this woman starts moving around the African American community in Harlem, and it just creates, there's some chaos that happens. But Nella Larson, the writer, and maybe this is also what we were talking about, had taken part of this story of this woman passing from an account of one of these very, very, very rich New York families, almost aristocratic in New York times, who had married a woman who was passing, and then found out at some point that she was black. And she claimed he knew all along, but his family discovered it. He claimed he never knew, and so he took her to court. That might have been the one, and he did he was chopping wood, he ended up chopping wood in Las Vegas. Yeah. This rich oil, like a Rockefeller rich. And so back to identity, it had to be a court that decided, is this woman truly black, even if she doesn't look like it? What do we call black in this country?
Right.
And then, if she is, then is that grounds for divorce? You know, and so they ended up getting divorced.
I ask you this question because I want to go to another question. In the past decades, there is an interest in based on a true story.
Oh, yeah.
And when you find out that a fiction that says it's based on a true story is not based on a true story, does it make a difference? Does something that is presented as a lie based on truth and turns out to be a total lie or fiction, does it matter?
It depends.
Give me
because
examples.
I'm feeling like you're setting me up for the next question. If the book were fiction and it's based on a true story and it's fiction, okay, that's fine. But then you have, if the book were supposedly a work by a journalist and it was passed off as like from reporting, and it turns out not to be true exactly, then I think there's a problem. Let me just say, Richard Kapuscinski's, I knew you were going, was that the question?
We know one.
The Emperor, which is a beautifully written book. Kapuscinski can write.
On Haile Selassie.
Yeah, that book on Haile Selassie. You know, and I remember Richard Kapuscinski had talent. That book that was supposedly based on a series of interviews of people who worked in the court of Haile Selassie, some of those details and the things that people said were just factually incorrect. No matter what you thought of the emperor, it was just factually, there were things that were just incorrect, and there were people who did not exist that he said he... Okay. However, the beauty of that book is that it is written in a way that you understand the truth of that time.
Yeah.
You understand what the revolution was,
Yeah.
it was coming,
Yeah.
and you sensed it. You sensed the real fear that people had of the emperor and the unfair systems that were in place at that time. And I think it did not begin to be called an allegory of Poland until much later, and much later after its publication.
Yeah.
And after I think he was starting to get pushback about the facts in here. But for what it is, I think if people just take it as a novel, and it is, in a sense, a series of fabricated incidents about a real moment, written by someone who is extremely talented. I think that's how I take it when I read it.
So what matters is how it affects you as a reader, not whether the facts are based on documents.
Right, and but I think, yes, as long as people understand what they're reading, is that.
Why is it different? Say, for instance, that all the facts were true, based on documents, and compare it to the same text, but you discovered that those facts that you thought were true were not. Why does it make a difference if it made you understand what the situation was at the time?
Because it wasn't just, well, with him in particular, it wasn't just that book that had fabrication. Kapuscinski has written nonfiction where he has written as a witness to certain events, where it was impossible for him to have been there.
But why does it matter?
Because he was a journalist. He was writing as a journalist.
So you're saying as if he were a priest and he sinned against the Holy Ghost, or...
When you're writing a dispatch for a newspaper, and you said, I was there when this happened, and these people were shooting, and they shot at me, and I survived, but you weren't there, then that is a problem.
Why?
If it were... Why?
Well, if I'm describing the Russian army coming into a Ukrainian village and shooting people and the dogs and then you discover it wasn't there, but the bodies are there and the destruction of the village is there and the Russian army entered, only I was missing.
If you were writing as a journalist, Alberto, and you were sending that off as
You're talking about the title page. You are worried if I tear out the title page, it doesn't matter.
If it's about not the title page. I mean, if it's a book, okay. But if it's a newspaper, which is what it was, and it was changing minds about certain things.
For many years, the TLS had only anonymous writing, so you wouldn't know.
But he wasn't there.
I agree.
And I will say that if you read the book, it has the word sun in it. One of Kapuscinski's collection of reportings about different places in Africa. When I was reading that, and there is he's supposedly in Nigeria, and he's describing certain things, aside from whether he could have been there or not. The representations of Nigerians, the representations of Africans were so full of stereotype that it becomes problematic in that. But then at the same time, don't know if he was there, but his depiction of that. But then there is the way that he treated his experiences in Rwanda, and I do believe he was there, were so psychologically complicated and so precise in their truthfulness.
But would it matter if this is your judgment on his text, would it matter if afterwards you discovered he wasn't there? Is psychologically it's profound and moving and correct?
I think as if it were, because he's a journalist. I do believe that the role of a journalist is different from novelist, even though maybe right now it's not.
You should be a Jesuit, Maaza. You should be a Jesuit.
But yes, and I have such issues with Kapuscinski. I know you love him.
Yeah.
And I think he's a talented writer.
But we can talk about Chatwin, who did the same thing. We can talk about Graham Greene, who did the same thing.
Yeah.
And well, Margaret Atwood has a wonderful little text called Murder in the Dark, where she describes this game of murder in the dark, where you turn off the lights and one is a murderer. And when in the game, when the detective asks people questions, the murderer, according to the rules of the game, and this is the end of the text, is according to the rules of the game, you have to lie. Now, do you believe me?
It's great.
Maybe we should open to questions.
Yes.
Yeah.
You have to close.
I will have to close. Okay.
Há perguntas?
Hi. Well, first of all, I'm a journalist.
Have you ever lied?
I'm also a person. Well, it was perfect. I wish we could stay here all day. Because besides from listening to how you discovered the story of your great-grandmother and all the things I've learned today from YouTube, I think it's really good to start a Saturday thinking. And when I say that, I'm a Brazilian person living in Portugal, and I always like to bring things to, well, reality, maybe mine, maybe yours, because it's really hard when you start thinking about global things. Oh, people are dying in Gaza, people are dying in Sudan, people don't talk a lot about those countries that are not so interesting for the press.
Yeah.
It's a shame, but that's true. Well, I'm talking a lot like you two, but I do have a question. But first I have an opinion. We are in a really dark place because of, I forgot the word, sorry, because of lies, because fake news. So Brazil is a place where fake news became the truth. And, well,
Yeah.
Temos mais uma pergunta e depois vamos fechar. Não sei se há mais alguma questão.
Eu queria agradecer ao Alberto Manguel e à Maaza Mengiste esta sessão extraordinária. Vocês são uma dupla incrível que vinham a sério. Vou convidá-los para fazermos qualquer coisa. Vocês são ótimos. Agradecer a todos, pedir novamente desculpas pelo atraso. E os livros do Alberto Manguel e o livro da Maaza estão aqui ao lado e eles ainda podem ensinar um ao outro, antes de irmos almoçar.
Quero agregar sobre o tema que estivemos a falar da identidade negra branca. Há romance fantástico da Harlem Renaissance, Negro Nunca Mais. É uma sátira onde descobrem uma droga para transformar os negros em brancos. É um caos total. porque o Ku Klux Klan começa a não saber quem é negro, quem tem que seguir. É fantástico. Maaza vai assinar os livros agora, não?
Sim.
Sim. Ok.